Some stories are told in ink, others are passed down in blood, and some are carved in silence, buried deep and left to fade until someone comes along to dig them up. I'm Erv Lenzy, and this is Finding Grandpa Charlie, a true crime-style family mystery about the man who disappeared and the women he left behind. Today's episode is about proof. Not the kind you tell your cousins over coffee, the kind that makes your stomach drop when it shows up on a government form. We're chasing the trail of Henrietta Waters, the woman Charlie married, abandoned, and never spoke of again. And we're chasing the echoes Charlie left behind in this one last podcast before our season finale next week. Charlie left behind draft cards, census documents, and finally, he left behind his own DNA. When I was a kid, we all knew that Granny Irma had a special connection to Henrietta. After all, Henrietta was her mother-in-law. But more than that, she was the mystery matriarch, tall, strong, and quiet, the kind of woman who didn't waste words. Granny described her as looking like an old Indian woman. That was the quote. She said it without malice, just matter of fact. Henrietta probably had long dark hair. I know she had a broad frame, and the family just kind of always assumed she was at least half Native American, probably more based on her stories. She never named a tribe, never elaborated, but in Texas in 1900, silence like that could be survival. The first place Henrietta shows up on paper is the 1900 census. She doesn't exist before then. By then, she's already a mother, already tethered to Charlie Henderson, already part of a tragic story that we'll probably never get in full. She told Granny she came from Indian Territory, what we now call Oklahoma. She had just left behind a father, a half-sister on a reservation. Her mother was gone, maybe dead, maybe disappeared. She came south to Texas to pick cotton. They might have arrived by wagon. We don't know for certain, but it was a one-way trip for Henrietta. I like to imagine that she stepped off a train in town, her family immediately looking for work, or possibly already had work lined up. In reality, it's more likely they rode steerage, which is much less glorious and impressive. Likely they arrived on the Katy line, maybe got off near Abilene. Just another teenage girl in a tattered dress looking for work. But here's the remarkable part. Henrietta could read and write. And in 1900, fewer than 60% of women in the United States were literate. And for Native or mixed heritage women in Indian Territory, that rate was even lower, often well below 30%. For Henrietta, literacy wasn't just a skill. It was a form of power. It meant she had some form of missionary education, perhaps something on the reservation, a missionary school, a tribal boarding school, and it meant that despite the silence around her past, she definitely had the tools to tell her own story, even if she rarely did. The year was probably 1897, and she was probably no older than 14. I tried to find her. I really tried. But she has turned out to be one of those veritable brick walls in my family history. I started with the name Waters, but Henrietta was born after the 1880 census. And the 1890? The 1890 census is gone, burned, and all that remains are tribal rolls, state census fragments, church registers, records held outside the main U.S. system. I combed through every family with the Waters surname in Indian Territory, and every time the trail ended the same way. No Henrietta. Or if there was one, the family was listed as black, not native. Most of the time, those were freedmen, descendants of formerly enslaved people who had been held by Native American tribes like the Choctaw or Chickasaw. Freedmen were emancipated after the Civil War, but were often left in a strange in-between place, denied full status by both federal and tribal governments. It took nearly 40 years till the turn of the 20th century for applications to finally start getting approved so that many of the freedmen could get recognized citizenship rights in Indian Territory. Every now and then, I would search for Waters in the land applications filed by Native Americans, hoping her name might appear in the Dawes rolls or similar records, but it never did. I searched in vain for a marriage certificate too, but Texas just wasn't consistent about registering marriages before 1900, and it wasn't until some time after 1905, 1910 that the state started reliably registering vital records, deaths and births and so forth. If they married, there's no state record to prove it. And as for their first child, John W. Henderson, there's no birth certificate for him either. No birth record, no tribal affiliation. There's no documentation at all. I have looked for decades. All I have are stories and census lines where she later claimed to be white and a few years older than she was. Tall tales and white lies the size of Texas. That's how girls like Henrietta survived, by blending in, by concealing the truth. By 1898, she was pregnant. By 1900, she was listed as Charlie's wife. But the foundation of that marriage had already started to crack, because at the same time Henrietta was calling herself a wife in Fannin County, Charlie was listed 175 miles away, living with his father as a single man. Two Charlies, one story, and a woman whose voice was already being edited out. Charlie's story, by contrast, left a few more marks. Census after census, 1880 in Fannin County as a baby, 1900, 20 years old as a husband, or maybe not, depending on which page you read. 1910 in the piney woods of Houston County, laboring at a sawmill, a wife, kids, a rented house near Ratcliffe. But for years, decades, the family has searched in vain for something more, some trace, some proof. And they found nothing, just silence. Now I hold the torch, passed down to me by 4 generations of Hendersons. And in 2025, I found something. Something nobody ever knew before. I actually found several somethings. A birth certificate surfaced August 23rd, 1912. A baby girl, unnamed, mother Henrietta Waters, father Charlie Henderson. It's one of the few places Henrietta's name is listed in her own hand, or maybe Charlie's. Either way, it matters, because the baby that died, Granny said it just once on tape, Henrietta had a baby girl. She died, didn't live very long at all. Then another discovery just weeks before the recording of this episode. A death index entry for their oldest son, John Henderson. The death date is interesting. March 4th, 1912. Houston County. Certificate number 7740. That's right, 1912. It's a hallmark year in Henderson family history. The record lists a name, a place, a date, like a ghost emerging from the fog. But when I contacted the Houston County Clerk's office, they had no record of that certificate, no physical copy, no microfilm, nothing in their files. The number exists, but the document is missing. Another mystery and a story already filed in a box full of mysteries. I tell you, folks, every time I think I have found an answer to a question in this story, it leads to another mystery, another question. Now let's start counting. 2 children lost within months. A son and a daughter gone before they had seen their teenage years, the same year. For Henrietta, the weight of that grief had to be unbearable. No birth certificate for John W. that I've found. No death certificate for the baby girl. It's kind of weird. No funerals that we can find, just absence. And Charlie, if he was there, and I think he was, may already have been emotionally gone. Or maybe it broke something in him. Maybe it hardened whatever was already fracturing. But for Henrietta, it was the silence that followed. Silence that lasted the rest of her life. And for Charlie, it may have been the final shove he needed to walk away from one life and start another. Silence. It's becoming a recurring theme in these podcasts. A silence passed down like a family heirloom, not in photographs, but in conversations, without names, and children buried without stones. It's the kind of silence that echoes louder the longer you listen. Because that same year, 1912, Charlie married another woman in Amarillo, Texas. Her name was Marie Josephine. We talked about her and her daughters on last week's podcast. Together, Charlie and Henrietta had 3 children, 2 daughters and a boy. Let's pause for a moment and consider the dates. John W. died on March 4th, 1912, according to the Texas Death Index. Just over 3 months later, on June 12th, Charlie legally married Marie Josephine in Potter County. While Henrietta was still grieving the loss of her son. Then on August 23rd, 1912, she gave birth to a daughter, a baby, who also died shortly after. That's right. While Charlie was hundreds of miles away, marrying another woman, Henrietta was pregnant, dealing with the death of her oldest son. The timeline isn't tragic, it's cruel. One son buried in the spring, a betrayal by summer, a daughter born and lost before fall. That June 12th marriage date, it stands like a dagger. If Charlie was present for the death of his son or the birth of his daughter, it's hard to imagine a more heartless act than running off and marrying another woman in between. And if he wasn't present, that may say even more. This wasn't just abandonment, it was erasure unfolding in real time. One son buried in the spring, one daughter lost before fall, a wedding in between. If Charlie was still physically present during any of these moments, he wasn't emotionally present for long. He was already gone. It casts a haunting shadow on the entire year, a series of exits that left Henrietta to carry both the silence and the sorrow all alone. The trail splits. One Charlie dies in Liberty, or so they say, falls under a train. The other gets remarried and disappears into the oil fields. Census records track Charles Newton, 1920 in Gainesville, working on oil rigs. Just before that, in 1915 in Oklahoma, where his first child is born. 1930 in Abilene, divorced, boarding. After 1930, the trail went cold. For decades, we had nothing. The 1940 census wasn't released until April 1st, 2012. The 1950 census came 10 years later, just about 3 years before the recording of this podcast. Folks, I wasn't doing genealogy research during that time. I was producing Cincinnati history videos on my main YouTube channel, Erv TV. Go check it out if you're interested. I was graduating from college, getting married, and launching a career. I was raising my son. I was dealing with my own life stressors, not trying to solve someone else's disappearance. Then earlier this year, in 2025, I sat down once again to take another look into Grandpa Charlie. I was shocked to find him in 1940 in Dallas, calling himself a metal worker, which makes sense. Going from the piney woods and sawmills to a rig builder, living as a lodger in someone else's house. A woman who died less than a decade later. She's listed as a homemaker. Charlie is listed as a boarder, but I wonder, and there's no way to know, did she too fall for Charlie? Was she another chapter in the story he never told? The record doesn't say, but the possibilities linger, like smoke from a fire long extinguished. By 1950, I found him in Dallas, still alone. No wife, no kids, now retired. But there were two anchors, two pieces of paper where Charlie wasn't just listed, where he declared himself. When the 1960 census is listed in 2032, we may finally have an answer to his last known whereabouts. But that answer may shock everyone because, of course, I know. I have evidence, real documented evidence that he was living not in Texas, but in another state. Not as a ghost, but as a man who simply kept going, one step ahead of the memory until the very end. During World War I, Charlie registered for the draft. He did it again during World War II. These were not online hints. These were his, in his own hand. I have what I believe are 4 copies of his signature, and 2, very reliably, were from the draft cards. The signature, Charles N. Henderson. The birth date matching January 13th, 1880. His address changed, his job changed, but the handwriting stayed the same. The first time I saw it, I just sat there, staring, like he had reached out of time and said, "Yeah, boy, that's me. I was real." He signed his name twice, once before 40, once after 60. You can't fake a signature, not across decades. The middle N, his middle initial, is stylized with a unique bump and hump, kind of like a small crown. He was proud of that name. Not everyone had a middle name in those days. Granny didn't. And his last name, it had flair, the kind of flourish at the end of the N that spoke of confidence, maybe even defiance. It was ink on paper, proof that he lived, proof that he stood before a clerk and said, "This is me." But I said there were 4 signatures, right? There were the other 2. Well, one appeared on his son Mike's birth certificate, the same unique middle initial, the same ending flare on that final letter. He signed it as Chaz, Charlie, or Charles, but always with that N. Always. And it wasn't like a capital N, like print and cursive. It was written like a lowercase n, but large. It was very unique. Always the N. Except the 4th, the death certificate for the baby girl who died. The one that almost looked like Charlie's signature. Almost. But he spelled his name Charley. He never did that. It was always IE. And he left out that middle initial. He never did that either. Still, the handwriting, unmistakable. I believe it was his. Even the version of him who signed it was already slipping away. In 2016, I spit into a tube and mailed it off to a lab. My mom had asked me to do it. She was always curious about our family roots. See, the Hendersons had stories, whispers really, talk of Native American blood, a reservation somewhere, an unnamed tribe. The kind of origin story that gets told once at a funeral and passed around like folklore. Just vague enough to forget, but not remember. When the results came back, they didn't hold any surprises. Mostly European. 0 Native American. Not even a sliver. And in that moment, what I felt wasn't exactly surprise. It was an absence. Another door that led nowhere. Answering one question only led to more questions, not answers. It was another silence that I had inherited. I wasn't upset about the lack of heritage on paper. I was upset because it meant the trail might really be gone. That what Henrietta carried could vanish with her, with no way to pull it back. And yet, I kept going. Because something told me that stories like ours didn't just disappear. They don't die. A few years earlier, Ancestry.com introduced a feature that changed everything. It let you tag someone in your family tree and isolate your DNA matches through that specific line. So, earlier this year, when I began researching Charlie Henderson again, I had a brilliant idea not long after I started recording this podcast. I tagged the man at the root of all this, the Reverend Robert Pickens Henderson, Charlie's grandfather, Robert Alonzo's father. And then it happened. The screen lit up. Dozens of matches, cousins I had never met, names I didn't recognize, people scattered from Mississippi to Oklahoma to Alabama, none of them tied to Henrietta, none of them tied to the family I'd grown up hearing about. These were descendants of Robert Alonzo Henderson's other children, the ones who didn't go west, the ones who didn't vanish, who stayed in Texas. But that one tool, a DNA tagging feature, did what more than a decade of paper chasing couldn't. It confirmed Charlie's roots. It connected me to the family I never knew that I had. People I'd never met, an entire web of relatives I didn't even know existed. And more than that, it confirms something crucial. Charlie faked his death. Charlie didn't disappear. His life didn't stop. It fractured, split off into separate lines and names and houses with no pictures on the walls. But the blood, it remembered. The chromosome still whispered the truth even when no one else would. If it wasn't just science, it was resurrection. There are stories the census can't catch, stories that don't survive in courthouse basements or the back of family Bibles. But DNA keeps going. It gets passed on quietly and visibly, and one day you spit in a tube and a stranger's name lights up on your screen, and the silence isn't so silent anymore. It was Henderson blood, and blood doesn't forget. In a way, I was cheated. I grew up knowing who my ancestors were, or at least I thought I did. You see, I come from a long line of genealogists, people who came before me that treated family histories like scripture, who could recite names and dates like hymns. Even Granny in her 90s on tape, telling me family history. On my mother's side, the lineage was neatly handed down. Granny's line was rich with stories, photographs, and heirlooms. There were names that stretched back to the Revolution, diaries, letters, sepia-toned faces, looking out from old black and white prints. You could chart a whole universe in those faded albums. But my father's side? Nothing. No Henderson names spoken aloud, no old photographs tucked in a drawer, no tintypes of solemn-looking men with long beards or stern women in aprons, hands clasped in front of flower beds. No stories passed down, just gaps, just silence. Maybe one of these days I'll do a podcast about Granny. It felt like standing on half a foundation. Like everyone else had a full inheritance, and I got the short straw. No roots to trace. No portraits to hang on memory's wall, just a last name, Henderson. And a series of unanswered questions trailing behind it like those of a loose thread. I didn't know then what I know now, that some people erase themselves. Some legacies get buried on purpose, but at the time, I just felt the absence, the cheat, the lopsidedness of it all. Henrietta left behind almost no paper trail at all, and Charlie did his best to erase himself completely. Charlie didn't leave behind an obituary, not really. There is a newspaper. There's lots of newspaper. It's not an obituary. Charlie made the news. Oh, yes, Charlie was in the newspaper when he died. That's not in my script, but I've got to say it. He didn't have an obituary, but oh my gosh, the story I'm going to tell on next week's podcast. But Charlie did leave a signature. Between them, they built a family, one that would fracture, disappear, and resurface 100 years later through the echo of genetic memory. Some stories are told in ink, others in blood. But the truth is told in both. I'm Erv Lenzy. This is Finding Grandpa Charlie. Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying this story, follow the podcast, leave a review. It really helps. Share it with someone who knows what it's like to go digging through history, chasing the ghosts we call family. And next time, I promise, we're diving into the story about Charlie's death. Charlie's real death. Not the fake death, not the disappearance, not any of that. The actual death. I have Charlie's death certificate from 1963. His parents' names are clearly printed on it. It was him. He was not living in Texas, but he died in Texas. And the story is literally explosive. Join me in next week's podcast for the season finale of Finding Grandpa Charlie. Thanks for listening.